All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that's been making a lot of noise lately. This Federal Small Business Assistance Act of 2024. Can this really future-proof businesses? That's what we want to kind of unpack today. And we've got a whole bunch of articles here. We've got stuff from the San Andreas Times, the National Business Review, and a few others. But our mission is really to unpack not just what the FSBAA did, but really how that impact is rippling out through the economy, especially when we look at some specific places like San Andreas, Vice City, and Las Venturas.
What's really interesting here is that we're looking beyond just a short-term Band-Aid. You know, the post-pandemic landscape. It was really brutal for a lot of small businesses. There was so much financial strain, supply chain issues, all sorts of things. But this FSBAA, which was spearheaded by President Wright and Vice President Hill, it was designed to be more than just a quick fix.
Yeah, and you know what's striking to me is it got bipartisan support, which is a really big deal when you look at the political landscape these days. And that, to me, signals that both sides recognize that small businesses are going to be vital to any kind of comeback. Can you remind me, what were the core elements of this act? What made it so different?
Well, it had a multi-pronged approach, for sure.
Yeah.
You had the direct financial assistance, grants, low-interest loans, things like that. But it didn't stop there. Instead of just giving blanket tax relief, they actually implemented specific deductions aimed at encouraging businesses to invest, almost like a reward system, to encourage them to plow money back into growth.
Okay, so almost like incentivizing the behaviors that they wanted to see more of, instead of just throwing cash at the problem. And I remember at the time, workforce retention was a big deal. Was there something in the act that addressed that?
Absolutely. There were tax credits, substantial ones, for businesses that were able to maintain their workforce or expand their workforce, which really helped with the labor shortage that so many industries were facing. But then they went even further, and this is really crucial, I think. They implemented these comprehensive training programs, not just the kind of generic how to run a business stuff, but training that was really tailored to the post-pandemic world, like shifts in consumer behavior, tech adoption, all of that.
So we've talked about the theory. Let's get into the details. How did all of this actually play out? In a place like San Andreas, was it all just smooth sailing? Or were there some bumps in the road?
San Andreas is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because you have so many different economic landscapes all within the same state. Like you have bustling urban hubs like Liberty City. You have the entertainment-driven economy of Las Venturas. And then you have the tourism and service industry powerhouse that is Vice City.
So a real test of whether one policy can hit all these different targets.
Yeah.
What did the data show? Did it actually move the needle?
Well, the reports show a significant increase in job creation and overall economic growth across the whole state. But it's more than just numbers. We also have some really compelling anecdotes from business owners themselves. Like the San Andreas Times did a profile on Maria Santos. She's a restaurant owner in Liberty City. And she actually credits the FSBAA with not just saving her business, but also giving her the tools to expand and to hire even more staff.
So a real tangible benefit for her, not just a theoretical one. And Liberty City is really interesting because they were hit pretty hard by the pandemic. Was there anything in particular about the FSBA that seemed to work well there?
It seems like those targeted tax deductions for reinvestment, they were a huge hit in Liberty City. A lot of businesses were able to use those savings to upgrade their equipment, improve their online presence, just things that made them more competitive in this new market. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about evolving.
I love that. That's Liberty City. What about Vice City? Totally different vibe down there. Did the FSBAA make an impact in that part of San Andreas?
Vice City is interesting because while they also saw job growth, the really noticeable impact seems to have been in workforce retention. Remember those tax credits that were tied to maintaining employee headcount? Those were really big in Vice City, where those service industry businesses really rely on skilled staff.
That makes sense. You can't have the iconic Vice City experience without the people to actually make it happen. Are there any stories from the front lines down there?
Oh, absolutely. The Vice City Business Journal did a piece on Eddie Delgado. He's a coffee shop owner, and he was actually on the verge of shutting down, but he got some funding. That not only kept his business afloat, but allowed him to expand and hire even more staff.
Wait, so he went from almost closing to actually growing. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's the power of well-targeted aid. And Eddie's story is not unique. We saw a nationwide increase in business survival rates after the FSBAA was implemented.
Okay, so we're seeing a positive ripple effect in Liberty City and Vice City. But San Andreas has another major player, Las Venturas. How did the FSBAA play out in that unique environment?
Las Venturas is a really fascinating case study. The Las Venturas Review highlighted how local businesses, especially in the city's urban core, really benefited from the FSBAA's focus on empowering those communities, grants, tax relief, those business training programs. It all contributed to a surge in economic activity.
So not just casinos and shows, but a whole ecosystem of businesses getting a boost. And it sounds like the Act's definition of urban communities really mattered here. Did they have a specific focus?
Yeah, they seem to prioritize areas with high concentrations of minority-owned businesses and businesses in areas that had been historically underserved by traditional funding sources. The idea was to try to level the playing field and create opportunities where they were needed the most.
And did that happen? Did they actually achieve that? Did we hear from any of those businesses in Las Venturas?
The Las Venturas Review featured a tech startup owner named Tony Bellini, and he was really enthusiastic about the long-term empowerment that the FSBAA provided. He felt like it wasn't just a temporary fix, but that it actually gave him the tools to scale his business and to really contribute to the city's growth.
So it wasn't about handing out cash. It was about giving them leverage to build their own futures. Which brings us to a bigger question. Did the FSBAA actually succeed in future-proofing these businesses? Or was it just a temporary reprieve?
That's the big question. And we've seen the immediate impact, but the real test is whether these businesses are now more resilient, more adaptable to whatever comes next.
Okay, I'm hooked. We have this snapshot of how the FSBAA played out in San Andreas, with real stories of success and some interesting questions about the long-term effects. But this wasn't just a San Andreas story. This was nationwide. So let's zoom out a little bit and see how the FSBA impacted the country as a whole.
It was a nationwide initiative, and to really understand the full impact, we need to look beyond just those individual success stories. We need to look at the bigger trends.
Okay, so let's talk national data. What's the big picture telling us?
Well, the National Business Review, they actually call the FSBAA a turning point in small business policy. And I think they might be right. Their analysis showed a significant correlation between the FSBAA's implementation and an increase in business survival rates across almost every sector.
That's huge. But survival is only one part of the puzzle, right? Did the FSBA do anything to actually equip businesses to thrive in the long run?
Well, that's where those training programs that we talked about earlier really come in. Remember, they're specifically tailored to those post-pandemic challenges. Well, the early data suggests that businesses that participated in those programs were not only more likely to survive, but they also reported higher revenue growth and a greater ability to adapt to those changing market conditions.
So it's not just about keeping the lights on. It's about giving them the tools to navigate this whole new world. And did this play out differently, depending on the region or the type of business?
Absolutely. For example, in regions that are heavily focused on manufacturing, the FSBAA's focus on technology adoption and supply chain resilience seems to have been especially helpful. We saw a big increase in investment in automation and digital tools, which helped those businesses become more efficient and more competitive.
So a tailored approach that addressed those very specific regional needs. That's pretty different from the kind of one-size-fits-all policies that we've seen in the past.
Exactly. That's what makes the FSBAA so interesting. It wasn't just about throwing money at the problem. It was about understanding the nuances of different industries and regions, and then actually crafting policies that met those very specific needs.
We've talked a lot about the economic impact, but were there any social or community level effects that are worth mentioning?
That's a good question. One thing that really stands out to me is the emphasis on supporting businesses. In communities that have been historically underserved, the FSBAA had provisions that specifically targeted funding and resources to minority-owned businesses and businesses in economically disadvantaged areas.
So an attempt to level the playing field. And to create more equitable opportunities. Did that actually translate into tangible results?
Preliminary studies are showing that the FSBAA did have a positive impact on business creation and growth in those communities. We saw an increase in the number of new businesses started by underrepresented entrepreneurs and businesses in those areas, reported having better access to capital and resources.
That's really encouraging to hear, but we also need to be realistic. No policy is perfect. Were there any unintended consequences or challenges that came out of the FSBAA?
Of course, one concern that some people have raised is the possibility that some businesses might become overly reliant on government assistance. There's always that risk that programs like this can discourage businesses from becoming truly self-sufficient.
That's a valid concern. How do we balance providing support with encouraging independence?
It's a tough balance to strike, and it requires constant evaluation and adjustment. One way to approach this is to build in mechanisms that gradually phase out the assistance as businesses become more established. Another approach is to really focus on providing resources and training that help businesses become more self-reliant in the long term.
So it's not just about that initial investment. It's about building a sustainable ecosystem that supports long-term growth and resilience.
Exactly. And that brings us back to our original question. Can targeted aid really future-proof businesses? The FSBAA provides some really compelling evidence that it can, but it also highlights how important it is to constantly assess these programs and make adjustments to make sure they're achieving what they set out to do.
It sounds like we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to discuss about the long-term implications of the FSBAA and what it all means for the future of small businesses in America.
You're absolutely right. And to really grasp the significance of this act, we need to look at the bigger picture. The FSBAA wasn't just a reaction to a crisis. It was a shift in thinking about how the government should be involved in supporting small businesses.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. So what was this shift in thinking, and how might it shape future policies that are aimed at encouraging economic growth and innovation? It's easy to get kind of lost in the weeds,
Right.
when we're talking about policy, but I think it's important to ask ourselves, what does this mean for the average person? How did this actually change the game for small businesses and for the communities they serve?
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? And I think one of the biggest changes with the FSBAA was that shift away from reactive policies, the kind that are just a response to a crisis, towards something more proactive, more investment-oriented. It wasn't about bailing out businesses that were already failing. It was about giving them the tools they needed to be more resilient, more innovative, more competitive in the long run.
So like a fundamental shift in mindset. And did this actually change the experience of business owners?
From what we've seen,
Yeah.
both the data and the stories, I'd say absolutely. Remember those stories we talked about earlier? Maria Santos in Liberty City? She was able to use that FSBAA funding to not only recover, but to actually expand her restaurant. And Eddie Delgado in Vice City, he was able to keep his coffee shop open and even hire more staff. And then there's Tony Bellini in Las Venturas. His tech startup got that boost it needed to really scale and contribute even more to the local economy.
Those stories are so powerful because they remind us that behind all policy jargon and all those economic numbers, there are real people whose lives are being impacted. These aren't just abstract ideas. These are tangible changes in people's livelihoods, their ability to contribute to their communities.
And it's not just about individual stories either. The impact of those successes spreads outwards. It creates jobs, revitalizes neighborhoods, and it just creates this sense of optimism and opportunity.
So we've seen the immediate impact. But how sustainable is this? Was this a short-term boost, or did it fundamentally change the path of these businesses and these communities?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And we'll need more data to really know for sure. But the early signs are pretty promising. We're seeing increased business survival rates, not just when the FSBAA was first rolled out, but in the months and years since then. That suggests that something more profound is happening.
And that something more profound is that shift in mindset
Yeah,
that we were just talking about.
exactly. By providing businesses with not just money, but also with training, resources, and connections. The FSBAA helped to build a culture of entrepreneurship, innovation, and long-term thinking.
So it wasn't just a handout. It was about empowerment, helping businesses become more self-sufficient, more adaptable, and ultimately more successful.
Precisely. And that's why I believe the FSBAA could be a model for economic policy going forward. It's shown us that when we invest in small businesses, not just as a reaction to a crisis, but as a core part of our economy, we can build a society that's more dynamic, more resilient, and more equitable.
That's a powerful thought, and one that I think will resonate with our listeners. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the FSBAA, what's the key takeaway you want to leave us with?
The FSBAA has proven that we can create policies that really work, policies that support small businesses, foster innovation, and create a better future for everyone. But it's up to all of us, policymakers, entrepreneurs, consumers, engaged citizens, to make sure we learn from this and to keep investing in the businesses and the communities that are the backbone of our nation.
That's a great point for our listeners who want to dive deeper into this, or maybe even get involved in shaping these policies. We'll have some resources for you in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the Federal Small Business Assistance Act and its impact on the American dream. Until next time, keep diving deep.